Yes, it's happening. Good afternoon, welcome to BAK. My name is Maria Hlavajova. I'm Artistic Director of BAK, Basis for Actuele, Kunst. Of course, I want to welcome you on behalf of my entire team. Apologies for such a delay. There are some train challenges that we're trying to negotiate, and we were trying to make sure that our speakers are here before we begin. Once again, thank you for joining us for this Proposition 10 Instituting Otherwise. Am I audible? Is it a test? Yeah. I hear myself twice. That's very confronting. Believe me. Anyway, up front, heartfelt thank you to all the contributors who I will be introducing throughout the day as we go. And of course, on a forefront, a note of thanks to the funders of this event, as it has been made possible with the support of the Dutch Ministry of Education, Culture and Science, the City Council Utrecht, VSB Fonds in Utrecht, Bankgiro Loterij Fonds Amsterdam, Prins Bernhard Cultuurfonds Amsterdam, and KF Hein Fonds in Utrecht. I would also like to acknowledge that BAK's main partner in the realm, in the field of education and research is HKU, University of the Arts, Utrecht, here in this city. And I'm glad to see a number of students joining us here today. Thank you also to the very extended team of BAK. And bear with me, I think everybody has worked so hard that everyone deserves to be named here. Haya Al-Salama, Lisa van Dijk, Julia Geerlings, Hide van Groningen, Lisa Hermans, Sanne Karsenberg, Inne van Leeuwen, Olga Leonard, Daniel Lodewegers, Steffi Maas, Witske Maas, Niels van Mil, Irene Kalabuch-Miron, Joanneke van der Molen, Alejandro Navarrete, Thomas Orbon, Eva Postema, Jun Saturay, Monique Sepp, Whitney Stark. It's a big team. Lisanne van Vught and Rachel Rakes. Rachel sits somewhere there. She holds also a microphone, and she will be kind of obliquely intervening when she thinks I am failing to be a good master of ceremonies, let's say, throughout the day. Of course, Jeanne van Heeswijk and her extended team, who has temporarily co-joined the team of BAK, Janneke Absil, Carina van Bezooyen, and Bobby Sayers, as well as the hosts and technicians taking care of us, all of us here today, Vera Mevis, Maud Berden, Iris Jousma, Carina Jansen, Anita Schuurman, Stephanie Burnett, and our colleagues behind the technical table, Jasper Verburg, Ruben Hameling, Tim van den Hoof, and Tom Jansen. Thank you for great work. This gave me a short opening to shift this microphone, trying to negotiate the technique here. One way or another, I really greatly look forward to this very long extended afternoon together. Of course, we are in the auditorium, there is a stage, and there is a tribune on which you're sitting. Nonetheless, I would want to encourage all of us to try to make a working session out of this. This is a bit of a motto that we try to adopt at the BAK, that we try not to perform, we try to rehearse. Rehearse collectively in thinking about that important question, what is to be done. To try to informalize coffee, tea, water is there at all times, and feel free to walk in and out of the room. If you need other beverages to get you through the day, I'm afraid those are not free of charge, it's just so that I said it. Before I really dive into some conceptual coordinates of today, a few organizational issues that I really want to go through. Importantly, please note this event is filmed and photographed. For the smokers among us, there's a designated smoking area in the back of the building. That's if you don't choose to stop today. Please don't smoke at the building's entrance. That's to respect the wishes of our neighbors in this extremely densely inhabited city center. coffee, tea, water, and other beverages I already had. For those of you joining us for dinner today, it's a vegan dinner prepared from locally sourced ingredients cooked by Silbeterams today at the Basic Activist Kitchen. And it took me a while to realize that the Basic Activist Kitchen stands for the BAK. And that already indicates that it's a truly becoming, or it already has become, a beating heart of this space, a project that has been initiated by artist Jeanne van Heeswijk as part of the trainings for the Not Yet. And lastly, but not least, BAK and this event aim at enabling a space that excludes any form of structural oppression, including racism, sexism, xenophobia, etc. And I hope that by attending this event, you agreed to participate in this space in a way that aids this goal. Now, to situate today's gathering, I'd like to use this moment to introduce a couple of sort of conceptual coordinates that I will hope to keep alive in the conversations throughout today. I'm going to be plowing through quite a volume of quite fragmentary notes, so bear with me, please. But with this, I would like to bring in a number of voices by artists, theorists, and other culture practitioners from mainly BAK projects and publications to kind of walk through how we at BAK try to conceptualize discursively and translate practically this notion of instituting otherwise. The project of today's gathering, Propositions number 10, Instituting Otherwise, is located or situated perhaps at the convergence of at least two main projects. Of course, trainings for the Not Yet and the series Propositions for Non-Fascist Living, which is a long-term itinerary here at BAK that we've been running since 2017. Now, the trainings for the Not Yet itself, and I quote, is an exhibition as a series of trainings for a future of being together otherwise, convened together with the multiple of collaborators by artist Jeanne van Heeswijk. It's currently on view. I hope you will have a chance to visit it in the course of the day if you haven't done that thus far. We will, I hope, have ample time to discuss conceptual and practical underpinnings of the project with Jeanne in a minute. But for now, I would like to, of course, thank Jeanne for extraordinary and extraordinarily challenging collaboration, but also for a possibility to rearrange this particular artwork within which I'm standing, which is a 2014 Mobile of Interdependency, Acts of Balance. It's a work by Afrikaanderwijk Cooperative together with Jeanne. And you see a mobile suspended structure from the ceiling holding a number of quite crucial words in Dutch, such as action, collective culture, self-organization, local, and value, something that I suspect we are going to try to negotiate in the context of artistic practices throughout the day. This mobile of interdependence, and you see that I'm negotiating a moving structure, so I really hope it will not collapse, but collapse by my presence or by these conversations. But I just want to stress this idea of delicate balancing act that I would want to encourage through our conversations and through our praxis, and in building a kind of improvised vocabulary. This is, you can see the piece, the mobile in its entire formation. I thought it would be important to put it in, but I would like to start building some kind of improvised glossary, and I would like to start with the word interdependence as something that is quite extraordinarily important for our deliberations today. But also, of course, the notions of collectivity and cooperation that kind of stem out of this work. And importantly, the notion of relation. I just want to caution, when I talk about relation, I really think about Edward Glissant, and decidedly not the notion of relational aesthetics of the 1990s, as something that indicates not a relationship between A and B, but actually a connection of everything to everything. And that gives a sense of some sort of totality and understanding that, that when you move, other things, other elements, and others move together with you, and other way around. If I mentioned that I will try to discuss in depth the project of Trainings for the Not Yet with Jeanne. Propositions 10, you could see in fact both as a temporary spin-off and an extension of the assembly of the project, of not just people, but ideas, learning objects, and relations that Jeanne has brought together, gathering mainly around the question how to be together otherwise. And I think that's something that that will be also equally like these other terms guiding our conversations. But also how to collaboratively, and that's a huge challenge. I kind of understand things theoretically, but practice becomes something much more complex, difficult, and challenges. How to collaboratively and collectively learn and rehearse something that does not yet exist. Yeah, and that brings me to this notion of the not yet in the project, using Jeanne's lexicon, another world and another future. All this is happening in the framework of the long-term BAK research itinerary propositions for non-fascist living that I already mentioned. And this project is prompted by the urgency that is researching of fascisms into the present. And then fascisms in their historical guise as well as their contemporary iterations. Fascisms, if you will, in their expanded sense, expanded historically, geographically, and substantively, as a clutter composite of multiple large-scale state, corporate, dictatorial, militaristic, and destructive conducts on the one hand, and on the other, of the micro-authoritarian impulses colonizing the everyday through patriarchy, misogyny, bigotry, xenophobia, racism, but also digital fascism, eco-fascism, if you will, and many other culture codes that are at odds with the values of social and ecological justice. I'm showing you a cover of the book that we received, I think, 2 or 3 days ago, so it's very fresh. I haven't yet checked it properly, but I'm quite excited to put this image on and to articulate the propositions as tentative but extraordinary, urgent matter. But if fascism, whether historical historical contemporary variations of fascism are continuously present, and I would like to keep it continuously present throughout the discussion, fascism is decidedly not the subject matter. It's not a theme of this project. Perhaps on the contrary, it's the resistance or absolute rejection of fascism that is a driving force behind the projects coming in life and specific to life, and specifically when we want to talk about how to be together otherwise. So the ethical and political foundations of this project lie in the tension then between the oppositional and the generative. So between the urgency to resist, determinedly resist the fascist predicament of the present on the one hand, and on the other, with the same breath, if you will, to think, imagine, and actualize the alternatives, the propositions, if you will, for non-fascist living. Now, this series borrows the term non-fascist life from philosopher Michel Foucault, as many of you will know. It does so in search of the means to generate knowledge about, develop proposals for, and activate tactics of the, and that's a quotation, art of living, counter to all forms of fascism, whether already present or impending. It is a form of life that continues, as Foucault says, deal with not only historical fascisms, the fascisms of Hitler and Mussolini, which was able to mobilize and use the desire of the masses so effectively, but also the fascism in us all, in our heads and in our everyday behavior, the fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates and exploits us. devising a set of principles to guide everyday non-fascist life on the basis of this brief quotation. Foucault cautions, and this is the last quote of his I will be using, to not become enamored of power. Now, throughout the day, we are going to examine the propositions for non-fascist living by looking at the possibility of the art institution in the present condition. And to be sure, power and institutions are intimate bedfellows, producing the governable subjects, the controlled and managed or manageable subjects, that is. The institutions does need to be examined from the perspective of the power relations and political subjectivity they produce. Yet in doing so, I would like to probe a question: how to enable, under such condition, instituting otherwise, in spite of the autarkic governance formed through what post-colonial thinker Stefano Harney sees as the times of logistical capitalism. In his contribution to the publication Former West, Art and the Contemporary After 1989, Stefano's text, titled The New Rules of Algorithmic Institutions, takes us on a chilling tour de force through a seemingly imaginary scenario in which a public contemporary art museum transforms in no time and without it being even noticed into private entity. Here, Harney walks us through the workings of the logistical capitalism, as I mentioned, under the spell of its access at speed dogma. Imagine a museum of contemporary art in a European capital, perhaps a city that is undergoing an uneasy transition from its heritage as a classical bureaucratic polity to an economy driven by a new logistical capitalism. This new logistical capitalism emphasizes services, tourism, transport, finance, health industries, and culture. Access plus speed is the formula of logistics and of logistical capitalism, powered by algorithms and their metrics, precedes only these imperatives. With metrics, no one cares what you have achieved. They only want to compare it against what more you could and will achieve. For instance, both residents and visitors must have more access than whatever they have now, whenever and wherever they want it, whether to banking, to shop hours, to medical clinics, to taxis. At the same time, shops and clinics collect big data. And the residents and visitors demanding access have access demanded of them. It seems like everyone in the city is beginning to participate in this privately administered world of access and speed, handheld devices, you heard one, at the ready. Culture, too, must be accessible and quickly available, and in turn, audiences might be accessed through participation, outreach, and education. The city starts an all-night art festival, throwing open the doors of its museums, galleries, theaters, and palaces, including our Museum of Contemporary Art, housed in a fine 18th century building granted and refurbished by the state in the 1990s. The city believes its all-night art event is about presenting a more civilized and lively life. But the event is also a welcome party of logistical capitalism. Now, clearly, the museum building and the collection, which once were the common good, are now hot commodity, changing gradually under the auspices of an accountant company in most cases. Imagine KPMG, who assists in international search for a new leadership. Museum gets a new cool leadership, a leadership of disruptive innovation. This is what the terminology we hear, who is establishing a new kind of system of checking on the efficiencies of the worker, with the consequent layoffs of inefficient workforce, with repurposing of the cantina for the workers of the museums and visitors of the museum into fancy cafe that are now use fancy coffee beans sourced from Berkeley in California, etc., to such an extent that even the radical curators within the museum start to whisper to one another, this coffee is indeed better. And then it goes, then it rolls. Yeah, the chef with number of Michelin stars who's ready to open the restaurant on the premises, etc., etc. And this is a seemingly invisible conversion of public property, public goods into absolutely private hands. I recommend to read this text of Stefano and read it performatively aloud. Because only then will one realize that kind of machine of business as usual and how stupid I was when reading it, not even realizing this very fact. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not to say the museums and art culture and art institutions don't need to change. They do need to change, but it's not this transformation that I have in mind. I hope I get the slides this time fine, because this is a kind of ending of that kind of case study by Stefano, where he says, this museum is an invention, but such are the pressures of logistical capitalism today that I know anyone associated with a museum anywhere recognizes almost everything I have said or will shortly. I could have told this story with some variations for hospitals or schools or universities. Algorithmic institutions fit a pattern, the pattern of logistical capitalism, access at speed to our labor, to our mood, to our future. These institutions may be nominally public, but they are privately administered in every way, including the levels of leadership and ownership. Banks, investors, and donors effectively own these institutions, and leaders work only nominally for the state. They work for the owners. I'm not reading from any chapter of this dystopian publication. And yet, even if Harney cautions that logistical capitalism is not optional, I nonetheless want to insist that the following questions be asked and answered not only discursively but also through praxis. How might the subject produced by and within such instituted regimes of logistical capitalism engage in generative resistance? Critique as proposition, if you remember. And thus not merely in critique, but critique as proposition. Not merely as some project of fiction, like we imagine, we plan, we dream, but as a project of fact and actually a praxis. In sync with feminist philosopher Athina Athanasiou, and that's another text from the same publication, I would like to think not on this scheme of possible versus impossible, but rather through the option of instituting otherwise as an absolute necessity, and a practice that we then adopt, and in the words of Athina Athanasiou following Derrida, we then live it as if it were possible. So the article, the essay called Performing the Institution as if it were possible, contains the following part. I quote, "The theoretical and political dilemma that arises is this. We need public spaces, homes, parks, schools, hospitals, libraries, and art institutions to sustain the possibility of living and being in common. And yet, at the same time, these institutions, with all their class, racial, ethnic, and gender inflections, are technologies of normalization and disposability. As they determine and regulate livability, they also compromise or negate the sustainability of certain modes of life. And they often do so while upholding the capitalist biopolitical genealogy of care, protection, and social security as socially ordained virtues historically associated with a privatized middle-class liberal morality. To phrase it differently, as much as instituted precarity saturates our lives under neoliberalism by rigidifying already existing inequalities and injustices and producing new ones, we cannot simply give up on the institutions that have been implicated in our suffering despite or precisely through their commitment to public interest. To put it bluntly, institutions sustain us and wipe us out at the same time." It is inside this very pressure point of institutions, same institutions that sustain us and wipe us out at the same time, that I see the process of instituting otherwise situated as one that engages in proposals and, despite or in spite of the circumstances at hand, in actualizations of livability and the life in common, and with it the notion of the public. And I will be using the notion of public both as an adjective and a radical noun that has been seemingly lost in the quantitative, populist, spectacular administration of access to high culture. Now, this administration, or this governance, if you will, is, of course, modeled upon bourgeois subject of reason, and thus on a privatized middle-class liberal morality. And it envisions the field of art as a sort of pyramidal triangle constellation with an artist on top. Some of you who went through the mill of art history education, you will remember the art is on top of the triangle, sustained by and distributed through the art institutions for the consumption to the so-called public. So it's privileging the artistic genius. This model has thematized then the audiences through various modulations of disinterested spectatorship as a passive subject of education, control, and sometimes, let's say, middle-class aspiration. Already in 1976, in the well-known Inside the White Cube, the ideology of the gallery space, Brian O'Doherty wondered, and this is a wonderful quote that many of you might have read but didn't quite realize, as was my case until somebody pointed it out to me. Who's the spectator? Also called the viewer, sometimes called the observer, occasionally the perceiver. It has no face, is mostly a back. It stoops and peers, is slightly clumsy. Its attitude is inquiring, its puzzlement discreet. He, I'm sure it's more male than female, arrived with modernism, with the disappearance of perspective. He seems born out of the picture and, like some perpetual Adam, is drawn back repeatedly to contemplate it, with his back to the rest of the world. The spectator seems a little dumb. He's not you or me, always on call. He staggers into place before every new work that requires his presence. This obliging stand-in is ready to enact our fancy speculations. Today, those denominators or those labels of spectator, observer, etc., would probably be kind of enlarged by other sort of labels: consumers, participants, and many other. I'm wary of these terms, of these concepts, specifically at the present, where we see a decisive deepening of the ideological contestations around the notion of the audience and the public. Now, these, however, are held not so much in the art institutions as they are on squares and streets and battlefields and even armed conflicts spread around the world at this very moment, as was the case in around 2011 when the book I just showed you, The Future Publics, The Rest Can and Should Be Done by the People, originate from and inspired by that wave of what we at that time used to refer to as Arab Spring. These contestations around the notion of public and audience are then manifested through the extensive, interrelated and enduring struggles by people who have come together as makeshift and tactical, inspired and courageous assemblies that demand equity and the right to have a voice in what are otherwise large-scale dictates by elite across the planet. The language is probably, from today's perspective, might feel a bit outdated. Huh? This is really still having that kind of sense of possibility that probably I experienced in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. Now, let's draw the contours of an art institution from here, as the institution that chooses to take part in that battle. It's the question of choice, I believe. An institution which, on the level of content, engages not in canonization of artworks, not in the short-term attention economy of spectacle, not in the competition of the latest hypes of artists, but in political aesthetic experimentations with the way of living the livable life in common. This institution earnestly recognizes its own entanglements with the histories and the presence of domination and oppression, and engages through praxis in continuous undoing of these colonial modern matrices of power. On the level of modes of production, this institution ambitious to set up its internal constellation so as to be able to practice through its art-driven political experimentation on a small scale the constellation of the world it yearns and imagines. So I wanna ambition to think through the notion of art institution that is a microcosm of that imaginary of a better world, to use a shortcut and a complicated, simplified, and at the same time simplified language. Then, in itself, the institution becomes a practice and the relationality that is modeling a world otherwise, and then living it, to refer back to Atina Athanasiou, in spite of the conditions of the world, as if it were possible. In this modeling, importantly, the constituencies are not the modern subjectivities of disinterested spectatorship, or the focus of some paternalist inclusion or integration or participation. We tend to think of participation in very kind of romantic, noble terms. But to participate in the institution scheme of things is not enough. The real participation would mean you are invited to change the rules of that very engagement. So the constituencies are not the modern subjectivities of disinterested spectatorship or the focus of some paternalist inclusion, integration, etc., but from the get-go, unceasingly, a prospective collective of accomplices, as Jeanne van Heeswijk regularly reminds me, of becoming a collective that comes to life, something that comes together, comes to being on the basis of the shared urgencies. With the accomplices, the institution that shares its material and immaterial resources of time, space, knowledge, relations, and of course money, in, once again, political aesthetic experimentations of how to be together otherwise, turning the institution, as I already said, but I want to repeat it, a microcosm into a microcosm of another society and another future, one that is driven by these ideals of social and ecological change, ecological justice. Try to make sure that this doesn't fall on me. Are you still with me? Now, this is an ecology of art field, conceived differently than the artist-centered triangulation that we know from Western modernity. Here, the artist loses, quote unquote, the position as if hovering above the society that would supposedly grant him a totalizing universal overview of the society, but she gains the possibility of solidarity and that very complicity with other subjects in this society, gains the ground in common embedded in these shared urgencies. The institution thus, which I envision, is driven mainly by these very urgencies shared across both the realms of art, society, and planet. So the starting point I see is the urgencies. So it's not replacing the starting point of the artistic genius with some other element within the triangulation, but the starting point is the urgency. Shared across the realms of art, society, planet, such as systematic environmental and social inequalities as they express through violence, persistent racism, technological dictatorship, as well as the fascisms and microfascisms in contemporary politics that condition the impossibility of a life in common. These urgencies, and I want to stress it then, are by no means the themes for BAK's projects. Instead, they are driving force behind the propositional work of collective, collaborative learning for the not yet. I'm not suggesting that we should be making exhibitions about the ugliness of the world. It's not theme, it's a driving force. Now, I find the delicate beginnings of prototypes and certainly possibility of such an institutional practice emerging at the meeting point of politically driven art production, artistic practices, the justice and equity-driven social movements, and the radical scholarship that busies itself with the same issues. This is what largely inspires BAK, and this very convergence between politically driven art production, justice and equity-driven social movements, and the radical scholarship. The question from the get-go for BAK was, could an art institution become a base, a basis that would be able to host or accommodate or provide some sort of hospitality precisely to these transversal overlaps or convergences among art knowledge and the political, for the want of better word. In search for the institutional model, BAK has been greatly motivated, as I said, specifically by a number of artistic practices, and there are a number of such artists we've worked with and from whom we learned, also speaking today. Of course, Jeanne van Heeswijk, Isshaq Al-Barbary, Matthijs de Bruijne, Jonas Staal, Patricia Carson-Hout, Nicoline van Harskamp, extraordinary artistic practices that emerge, in my view, from within the emergencies enveloping the society and the planet at the present. They are, once again, both theory-informed and politically driven, and they engage in thinking about how things are, imagining how things could be otherwise, and then intervening, actively intervening into the live world by embodying, actualizing these alternative imaginings. Remember Athanasio, as if it were possible. Necessarily, they traverse freely across disciplines of art scholarship and through spaces of politics, acting in transdisciplinary, indisciplinary, or non-disciplinary ways, bringing together unexpected convergences of many forms of knowledge and many forms of constituencies. It is a form of worlding and future-making, and as they engage not merely in making artworks, but making worlds. Now, in relation to the art institution, or let's say progressive art institution, for again, want a better lexicon, such practices are in themselves the instances of instituting and instituting otherwise. Not in opposition to the institution, which is a novum in that field of institution critique, not in opposition to the institution, so not in the institution critique mode, let's say, but in the generative mode of critique as proposition, if you will. So we do not remove the critical towards the institution, but we propel that critical into the propositional, generative, creative mode, if you will. So these practices are what political theorist Gerard Drowning would call instituent practices. And they're creating proto-institutions that are already pre-enacting forms of world one desires and imagines. Raunic defines instituent practices as the actualization of the future and a process and concatenation, difficult word for me, of instituent events that does not oppose the institution, but it does flee institutionalization. So it's the process in continuous movement. So it does not allow itself a possibility to solidify and thus die as the institution. This artist-inspired ideal of instituting is what has shaped BAK as an institution that is a matrix of possibilities rather than fixed contents or structures. One that can be composed and recomposed in sync with the emergent culture, technological, economic and environmental frameworks, with issues of class, race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, and so on. Here, too, instituting is envisaged not as an isolated act, but as a continuous process. Unlike with the artistic practices, I do not believe institutions such as BAK, which is essentially a mainstream, a well-publicly funded institution, could claim that we flee institutionalization. I think this would be just a huge pretense that I wouldn't want to communicate to you. So it's a continuous process, a push and pull back and forth between occupying the concept of the institution when it pragmatically is necessary, resisting it, refusing it, reinventing it, and then occupying it again. that's both unsettling and defending the institution of public life. BAK has been envisioned as a basis, as a base, a modest yet critical understructure, if you will, a foundation. In stark contrast, I remember those conversations 20 years ago, in stark contrast to any place that would call itself a center, like a center of something. Yeah, that's the fallacy, I believe, and we need to be in this process of decentering, off-centering, and thus decolonizing these practices. And thus, basis is an infrastructure that is envisioned as one that can lend itself in variety of ways, time and again, to sustain the creation of imaginaries as other ways of knowing and acting. This is how I understand the potentials of the spaces of art today, opening other ways of knowing, of imagining, and of seeking to act upon them. That is, escaping the dominant, debilitating distrust in the possibility of another world, if you will, and dissenting from the paralyzing binarism of possible versus impossible, inside versus outside of the institution, the system, etc., and constructively repurposing those into the practice of and in the otherwise. Now, the otherwise, of course, evidently relates to the dialectic of the self and the other. Huh? It's that kind of dialectical constellation that the otherwise wants to challenge. Despite the very fact, or in spite of the present world that is predicated on this kind of dichotomies. To be, think, imagine, and practice in the otherwise, however, means refusing to be one or the other in this kind of dichotomies. So the otherwise is an active refusal to play with the rules of the game as set up by logistical capitalism to the extent possible. Now, this repurposing of the dialectical positioning into an active, imagining, creating, and inhabiting of alternatives in instituting otherwise, thus aims not just at changing the institutions, but, I got to believe, at shaping the not yet, for which the art institution, the institution as such, can become an important vehicle in the times when other spaces are barricaded by other than public interests. Maybe then can a yearning for truth, for us, for the world otherwise, and these are the terms that Jeanne van Heeswijk has been repeating to me over the last year or so, as something that she lives by, something that she has borrowed also from extraordinary thinker and theorist Marina Garcés, in her call to commitment and honesty with the real. So maybe only then can this yearning for truth in the honesty with the real, for us and for the world otherwise, begin to take a more concrete shape. And only then we can try to live it as if it were possible. Thank you. I forgot lots of wonderful slides, but they'll come back. Because at this point, I'm going to ask Jeanne to join me. You see, we stand. By the way, if I started from this particular work, the mobile of interdependency or interdependence, I forgot to mention another work, and that's the work Participate or Die, there in the middle of the room. And we somehow tried to prevent people sitting in the row of chairs behind it, but we didn't manage. So I precisely now see, oh, we did? Gosh. It's me. Apologies. Why I'm saying this? Because this is a set of mics that are on, actually. And anytime you wanna get in a conversation from that kind of position, please feel free to walk to it and just interrupt and ask. or we can try to run with microphones to reach to you. But Jeanne, thank you so very much for joining.
Yeah. You're keeping standing.
No, that's not right, is it?
It's okay, but I want
this
to
is
sit.
nice. Jeanne, trainings for the not yets, and this idea of an exhibition as a series of trainings. Could you speak to this, just to kick off somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think I sort of like started to think through my work and through some of the practices that I've been doing over the last years about like what comes out of the workings with specific groups in the city or on location, and what these kind of learnings actually, what constitutes these kinds of learning. So I started to think about some of the methodologies that were developed, or some of the learnings that were developed in different ways. So I was thinking about objects no longer as what you would call art objects, but started to thinking about what are learning objects. What are these objects that come out, or these spaces, or these relations, or these conditions? What are it actually? How can they be presented, but also how can they be re-inhabited? And I think that is something that was very important for me to think through. So how can we rethink, rework, re-practice some of the learnings that come together with working with peoples in various locations? And so I started to think about bringing together these objects, these learning objects, and then actively practicing them together. So for me, it was like bringing together an exhibition as a series of trainings in which we practice what it means to become collective.
And then, how do you see this notion of the not yet? I'm gonna go into glossary writing kind of mode, I think.
I think I see the not yet as that what is not yet realized. I think like I don't want to talk about the future as such, like training for the future or training for some projected future, because I think like I think we have to understand that we are in a moment in time where maybe for us to think what might happen post-apocalypse or trying to think about other ways of how to project progress. I think for us it's maybe very important to think like what are we doing when we are together at the end of time, if you want, not the end of history, but the end of livable time. So how are we actually, if you make it very like dramatic, how are we going to die together, if that would be the question? So like, how would we do that? What would we commit to? To whose realities would we commit? To whose survivals would we commit? And what kind of practices of like becoming collective, of fighting together, are we actually imagining? What are these imaginaries that we can think through? Or as somebody, as David Harvey brought up about yesterday, is like, what is the poetry of the future? So how do we think through that? How do we think through these notions of being together otherwise? And how do we practice them together? And for me, the not yet means that we train together to become collective for a future that we do not know yet, that we cannot yet imagine, but that we still know we need to practice there to be together. And I think for me that is sort of like important to think through about what kind of commitments can we create, what kind of ways of being together can we practice.
This notion of the end of livable time, we had extensive discussions about in the beginning, because that was also originally something that you were intending to bring to the title, and there comes an institutional governance administration saying that's too dystopian. But I remember reading together, actually at the times when you were a fellow here at BAK, last academic year, I think, Marina Garcés, that's the writer I quoted in the relationship with the notion of honesty with the real. And Marina Garcés there says, we have reached the end of livable time, and livable time is a time when the humans still have capacity to intervene. Yeah, so that the idea of how do we learn to die together is something that's your addition to it, but essentially it's to bring across the extreme urgency, also in relation to institutions that go with the business as usual, nonetheless. Yeah, and that notion of urgency, how that notion of urgency redefines what not only institutions do, but what artists do at this point in time. So the idea of the future you eliminated because of that kind of impossibility of the future, is that?
Yeah, and also this idea of like about linearity. So like that there's still this idea of progress, of direct linearity. So to think
betterment.
And betterment, so that we also think about other modes of time, about other modes of temporalities, that we think about maybe non-linear time, about time that is maybe local. So about other modes of time and place, which for me are very important in this idea of notion of training for the not yet. It's like, so how do we also spatially and time-based create different practices? And I think this is for me, for instance, one of the things, and everybody that's been involved in trainings for the not yet know that it is also a very intense schedule. It's not like called workshopping the future or workshopping the not yet. It's called training the not yet. So which means also that we are practicing here 5 days a week, relentlessly, and not as an event. 7 days a week at the moment. But not to just do more programming, but also to take the time to really unpack certain urgencies together, to spend time together, to practice, to unlearn, to learn together, and to create embodied experiences of what it means to do that together. So there is a rhythm, there is an embodiment, there is time taken, time spent, and sometimes even time wasted, you know? So.
Yeah. And to a great extent, the project redefines the formal kind of elements of how we've been kind of sensitized to consume art, right? So, I mean, you put pressure on things such exhibitions. Yeah, we had long discussions, is this an exhibition, is it not an exhibition? We had long discussion, is this educational program, is it not? Because one falls always kind of necessarily into those kind of traditional categories that we all feel very comfortable with. Yeah, we know how to make exhibitions, we shuffle objects around, and no offense, huh? There are also good exhibitions that I've seen in my life, 2 or 3. But we were talking more about the notion of an assembly. Mm-hmm. And that goes my imagination going, huh? Because in this post-human convergence, if we refer to the present as a post-human convergence, you can think assembly beyond human bodies. Huh? So it's an assembly of human and non-human, organic, non-organic, living, non-living. So you actually can see exhibition and trainings and people coming into the space as one large assembly that is on one hand providing evidence that we share certain urgencies and provides a space for that assembly to come to life. Is this something you're thinking about?
Yeah, I think for me that is very important to think about different ways in which people gather, but also different ways in which people sort of like experience that what's happening in the space. Like you used this example of like the relationship that's normally always with the back to the space and with the face to the audience, and here to the object. And here there is this way in which sometimes that can happen, but simultaneously people are gathering and talking together. Sometimes people are presenting and sending. Sometimes people are listening. And this is not like one format, but it's a constant format of like different ways of assembling, of being together, of sharing space and sharing attention. to certain things. And I think for me it's important that somebody that comes to maybe see the show also notice that there is like maybe something happens. Sometimes you can listen in, sometimes you can not listen in because it is in a closed session. And sometimes at the end of every training we eat together. Because like one of the things that like I think is also important in the whole trainings for the Not Yet is the activation of the kitchen and the work the Basic Activist Kitchen does, the BAK, in which another set of relations is brought to the table. So it's also every time again of bringing different sets of relations into the space of ways of being together and to practice that, to train that, to take that apart, to reassemble that, to recompose that if you want. And for me, this rhythm of creating forms of relationality in time, in space, is very important. And I use the word rhythm for it because I think it has a rhythm. And then, you know, if you think through trainings that have been happening, which I think is important also, it's like, you know, for instance, thinking about Joy Marima Smith's training, who the very first time when we were sitting in the dome, everybody was going to sit in the circle. The dome also invites for that automatically because it's a dome, it's half a circle, so you go to sit in the circle. And she was immediately like, okay, just to say it up front, sitting in a circle is one of the most oppressing forms there is. So it's sort of
neoliberal think tank sits in the circle.
Yeah, so she says, like, can we just create another configuration? Can we sit in ways that you might sit with the back to somebody, but what does that to your listening? Or what is that asking from your listening if you don't see the person? You know, so this kind of like taking time to even figure out a whole day how we can sit in a space and listen and learn and study. I think this was a very important like lesson. But then again, somebody like Carmen Papalia takes in his session a week later, he asked what it means to really create spaces that are accessible. And, you know, I quote him, and I always, I have to curse when I do that, when he says, like, fuck the wheelchair ramp. Like, not so much because he doesn't believe in creating accessible spaces, but also that these accessible spaces are often only created to ticking boxes. Oh, if we have the wheelchair ramp, if we have this and that, like we have an accessible space. And he says, and he himself is a non-visual learner, as he calls himself, because he's also legally blind. He just says, like, what would it mean to create spaces in which people that have specific needs feel the agency to express those needs, and that there then is a space that welcomes these needs and find ways to address them. This is something else than just creating an accessible space. So he talks about access intimacy. Then I think about training we did with the Voorkamer, who an organization here in Utrecht that went with us through how do we design inclusive spaces, using the word inclusive, which we all find a problematic space, but then taking it apart and talking about what proximity means. So access intimacy, proximity, like other forms of listening. So how do we practice that together? So like most of the trainers and all the people that have been training, because this has been also an amazing cohort of people that some of the people have been coming back again and again, and I see some of you in the room here, welcome again, to accompanying us on that critical journey, to accompanying all of us as a learning and a learning again, and interjecting and trajecting their own curves and questions into this. So for me, that is very important, you know.
But so you started from the temporal axis of the life of an institution.
Yeah.
Talking about written, and then you shifted to the spatial, and you already mentioned a lot of things. But there is one very important challenge that you presented to us. You know, we are very well trained to make sure that every artwork is well cordoned off so that nobody touches it, that there are certain humidity and temperature conditions for this. And what Jeanne started to do, a hugely expensive art object would be just hung in the middle of the hallway so that people go like this with it. And of course, all the fumes from the kitchen and all of that. And that's a nightmare scenario for any art institution. And essentially, it's not possible in the conditions of the world today, unless you find artists prepared to give a special permission against the will of their galleries, owners, public museums, owners, etc., etc. And I found this one of the extraordinarily challenging things, that we do not delineate a space for art objects. It's well taken care of, and then for gathering of people, for discussions, it's all kind of collapses into one another. So the artwork, an object, becomes something else. And I think that's where the shift lies from an artwork or an art object to learning object. Because in the beginning, I have to say, I didn't quite understand. I was like, are we just naming art objects to learning objects? But they suddenly become part of the life of the training in a particular way. You want to talk about that kind of collapsing of the distance, if you will. I don't even know whether this is the right language, but I'm trying.
Yeah, I think for that, I always want to take the dome as an example, because I think that is maybe an interesting way, and also the way in which it came into being for me, that led to think about what these kind of learning objects are, but also this idea of trainings. And to do it very briefly, is that when the dome comes from Philadelphia Assembled, in Philadelphia, a multiple year project in which a lot of different groups worked together to unpack the urgencies of the city of Philadelphia and to present it in one of the larger museums in the States, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, at some point. And it moved itself through like a year in which groups of people talked together to unpack those urgencies, to then presenting to places in the city in which they felt they needed to amplify the work being done, and then bring that back to the museum. And one of the urgencies that people were addressing was the notion of sanctuary, or the notion of safer spaces or refuge. And from an American perspective, this notion of sanctuary belongs to this idea of sanctuary cities. I always have to say that are cities that call themselves sanctuary cities, that actually say they actively not work together with ICE, which is the organization that picks up migrants and deports them. And when Trump came into office, one of the first things he did is actually saying that those sanctuary cities would be punished by taking their public funding away. So like this discussion about being a sanctuary city was very important. And the group of people that gathered around this notion, this urgency of sanctuary city, cities giving refuge, providing safer spaces for its residents in all their forms, was a group that came together, and there were sort of 25 different people gathering from all walks of life and from all different organizations that sort of dealt with safe space, of safer space, of refuge. And in the very first meeting, they figured out that actually they didn't share a value set in common. Although they were working around the same urgency, they couldn't come up a list with like, we are in solidarity with A, B, C, D, and we all sign off on that. They had like internal discussions about it. So what they did is they changed their name into Towards Sanctuary, but that's easy. You change your name in something else. That doesn't mean it's something else. But they did also something else which I thought was very interesting. They said like, okay, let's suspend judgment for now about which value is more preferable, or which, let's stop that discussion and maybe end up with like a statement of like, we in solidarity with everything and everything, but nobody knows how to uphold that then, because this super nice statements and manifestos about what we all should do and practice, but then how do we uphold them? So they went into it. They went onto a program in which they went to each other's organization to practice how each of them was doing their work. So basically, they went to train with each other. What it meant for the Ethic Youth Center, an LGBTIQA youth center for homeless youth of color, how they practice a form of refuge and welcome. They went to the New Sanctuary movement and learned about how they are practicing offering sanctuary to newly arrived immigrants, and so on and so on and so on. And then coming back after that, they sort of like did something is that they said, like, we do not need a space or one solution or one manifesto. What we need is a stewardship program. We need to create a program that, you know, works in such a way that it can create the conditions for us trying to practice safer space. And this is like, it sounds like a 6-step removed. It sounds like a 6-step removed. I have anyway a loud voice, but it sounds 6 steps removed. But this idea about how do we create the conditions, in this case for being together otherwise, that would be able to uphold some of these values around the safer space and the sanctuary that were so dear to most of these people. So there the idea is like how do we do that? How do we create those spaces? And I think this dome, that is a structure, it's even a well-known structure, but with its practice and its understanding about what would be needed to create the conditions to hold conversations that could steward this kind of discussions, it might be one of those spaces. So for me, that made it a learning object. It made it a learning object, but it has all that learning with it. It doesn't just come as a nice structure with a nice door. It comes with a stewardship program for the conditions of being together in that space otherwise. And I think that makes it, for me, a learning object. And it's maybe also a beautiful object in itself, but it's a space that can be inhabited, that can be retaken, relearned, unlearned, and practiced with. So it's a tool, if you want. Although I don't like the word tool.
So what is the trace that your project then leaves in the institution? Because what, of course,
you have to formulate that.
Does it just shake, you know, that kind of exhaustion after a project and then go like, whoops, and it's back to its business as usual? Gosh, I articulate some hope out of the exhaustion of this project somehow, probably. But of course, I'm looking back at a number of collaborations we at BAK have engaged with, like for example with We Are Here collective of undeportable, undocumented refugees who put it into their kind of mission that they engage in collaborations with the institutions, but make sure that when they leave the institution is changed at the same time, yeah, forever. And of course, through this collaboration with you, for BAK, we're searching, we're trying to learn what is it that we can continue doing, how to do it, what does this mean for the team, what does this mean about how we apportion the budget, where the budgets go, yeah? So it has very many, very concrete, tactile, pragmatic and difficult and stupid administrative kind of things that one needs to resolve. But they are, at the same time as they are, you know, they appear boring, they're extremely important because they are, you know, changing the infrastructure of the art institution. So what's your goal with these institutions you're working with?
I think that's also when we talk about the training, is that we also maybe practice muscles that we didn't know that we had. So to figure out another, like you could say, embodied configuration of, and you called it the collapse of the triangle, but I think it's another embodied reconfiguration of what it means to create this kind of instituting otherwise. So it's training another set of relationalities, another set of configurations, which you might find back in your budget, but it's also like, how do you really collapse the relation between the artwork, the program, the artist and the institution and the audience? So if you really want to do that, we have to practice, I think, committing ourselves to sharing these other realities and to find way to create new relational structures. And this is an embodied practice to me. So like I'm not so sure how you're going to collapse that triangle yet, you know? So, but I think for me, like the practicing of it in itself, I think is what I hope that BAK could continue, and maybe not like 5 or 7 days or 9 days a week in the rhythm that it's doing now, but also not default, maybe going back to an exhibition with, you know, 5 public programs. But what does that mean? You know, it also means thinking differently about everything. And then, of course, there's always a question about, like, you know, I also know that most of the people working in BAK had to go crazy because the amount of, like, Facebook posts we had to make and this kind of things, like, was enormous. And then, you know, like, I also know that there are in my own circle people that said, Jeanne, I cannot get another mail from you about something other interesting that's going on. So I think we also should let loose of the fact that this then has to be continuously full house. You know, that most of the trainings, some of the trainers said, okay, 15 people is enough. It's better than 20 people half attentive, better have 5 people being attentive, you know. So how do we then relate all of these questions back? So I think it's a fundamental asking different questions about what this means, how to collapse literally this thing. And this is, like, for me, it's also like in my work, I think about not so much about participation. Like we said, that's not a very valuable thing. So it's not about asking people to participate. You know, I think asking people to co-make, to co-create what is happening in the building. But that means also that you cannot be in charge of what happens. That means that people take it the direction they feel they take the direction. They maybe ask questions about the needs they have to be able to access or to take agency in the situation. And how adaptive can you be to all of these questions while staying also critical and reflective and on a journey. So this is, for me, means practicing otherwise. Having yourself challenged, having your subject position be questioned, and allowing yourself to be trained by other people about doing it. So I think it's something different than saying, okay, we are an institution that doesn't allow for any forms of oppression. But how do we undo our own ways in which we do it by being daily in the space already? So all these questions, I think, all the time. And for me, that collapse of that triangle you spoke about, for me, that is a assembled practicing together. So for me, it's maybe not, I don't know if it's a collapse, but it is finding another set of forms of commitment. And I think that has also been very important for thinking through trainings for the Not Yet, about the fact that, you know, there's always a combination make between local, national and international training together around a certain thing. And this idea of the BAK basis for, as we discussed, like how can BAK also become a basis for certain people to collectively practice these urgencies in the city together. And yeah, these are one of the things that we try to figure out. Did we all solve them? Absolutely not. You know, we had some very fantastic meetings. We had some difficult gatherings.
You notice I asked Jeanne about Philadelphia Art Museum. She answered about BAK. So I wonder whether I should re-ask or offer the floor. I didn't see anybody on next to the microphones, but there are more mics here if you would like to. Are these on?
You both spoke of urgencies, and I was wondering, as sort of reasons to work through and move forward with something, I was wondering if you also look at the sort of evaluative regimes of how institutions are evaluated and how you need to justify them. So also from that perspective and undoing some of the metrics. So in a way, going back to what you said in the introduction about the algorithmic evaluative aspects of this institution or such institutions.
I mean, you know, if I'm in my own critical self, and now you're standing and I'm sitting here in the middle. Okay. Yeah. Oh, you want to run with the mic? That's also good. I think, like, you know, I am also. I know the new kunstplan is coming up, so which has a very interesting set of demands. So I'm pretty sure that some of what we're practicing here will find its ways in BAK's policy plan.
I mean, of course, and it's of course.
You know, so I say that, and not to be cheesy about these things, but to say, like, you know, there's always ways that one needs to evaluate and needs to do that. And I think as part of what we do here with Trainings for the Not Yet is that we actively have something we call the Dreamscape, which is our way of annotating whatever's happening through these trainings on the walls by adding new works, adding particular thing, reorganizing spaces and adding on top of that. So that's our internal, let's say, evaluation, that we remap, rethink, annotate, retake some of the things that are happening. So that's one of the internal evaluations that we're doing, like within Trainings of the Not Yet. But at the same time, I think we are actively talking about what it means for an institution to keep this practice within their spaces and to question some of these boxes that are asked for, like, what is it, inclusion, fair practice, and I don't know. Diversity. So, like, you know, these boxes that are asked for. So, you know, like, you know, of course, you can again make this very beautiful list of all the things that you want to do, but how are you actually going to practice them? And more strongly, how are you going to uphold them? So the question is more about the upholding of that value set that you might create.
And to add to it, it's not just upholding, but there is another element to this, because, of course, speaking about the administration of an art institution, of course, you're depending on certain funding and you need to account for it. Now, you try to live through an ecological qualitative model of an art institution, but you need to account economico quantitatively. And that's the gap that is extraordinarily important to find ways to negotiate, yeah, between ecological qualitative that you want and economic quantitative upon which you are being evaluated. But I'm of belief that as art institutions, we also need to this is complicated. I don't know how to articulate this so that I don't get myself into a terrible trouble. You can say it, yeah, because say, Laura, thank you.
One of the things that I think about a lot, especially with respect to this question of evaluation and metrics, is that, in fact, it's our responsibility as the cultural sector to teach the people who ask for the metrics what the metrics should be, rather than the ones they are asking for, because there's this complete need to revamp what those metrics are. They don't, a lot of the quantitative pieces that you're talking about don't necessarily make sense. We need to kind of come up with a new thing, and I think that's been very difficult for us as a sector to do.
Thank you, Laura. And I think this has to do with this notion of participation. And I wanted to say, I hear the culture sector complaining about the rules and stuff like that, or they say politicians don't understand what we do. Of course they don't. But it's our fault to an extent, yeah? And it's terrible to say this, because everybody goes like, no, it's there. So the question of negotiation, which is that notion of participation that I would embrace. So refuse to participate on somebody else's terms. Go and engage in the process to change the terms of that participation. So that's that sort of reversal. So it works not only direction, audience, participation in the art institution, but also art institution participating in a certain, you know, administrative bureaucratic scheme of things that we need to actively really advocate changing. And so that's the addition, and it's about building narratives and nearly glossaries in order to understand certain terms. Oh, lovely, thank you. I need to move. When I sit down, my brain shuts. Sorry.
No, I think it's also important to say that it's a choice of being part of that ecosystem as an institution. So it's not like there's also a way without public funding to run an institution. So sometimes I'm interested in why that's not an option for BAK, or why you don't go back to that sort of essential question, but say, this money we need, so we need to change it. But you could also do it without the money.
I wish.
Well, I don't know. I think that's an interesting discussion. And also I think we choose our politicians. So claiming that we need to educate the politicians is also, I think, again, being trapped in that same system, while I think there is a more fundamental question beneath it. I don't know. It's not a real question, just a remark, I guess. Sorry.
No, thank you for sharing, indeed. What are the other options when not public funds, private funds or no funds? With every money comes ideology you need to kind of live up to. So to think public money doesn't have ideology or private money does not have ideology is just simply mistaken. Because every money comes with the list of requests to fulfill, yeah? And if I am critical of privately administered world that pretends to be public, I really want to go with public money. I think we need to insist that public funding is there, it grows and supports activities that would not be possible in the commercial world. So this is my interest. To work without money in that world we're dreaming about that might be possible, I'm wary. I wouldn't know how to do it, yeah, without funding at this very particular condition. So I'm pragmatic in this respect.
Yeah, and I think what for me it's not about I think can we do it without money? I mean, maybe that's not the question. I think we might be able to do things without money if we find better way of distributing the money there is. So I think it's about finding other systems of redistribution also within institutions. And I think we can all dream of a world without institutions, but I think they were there for a reason, and some of them also still have the capacity to protect some of the public good. So I would also not want to throw them overboard immediately. But I think it's very important to say that we need to find other ways of distributing knowledge, distributing money, paying, and that's, I think, is part of the process of decolonization is to practice other modes of all of that, without necessarily going to another extreme. Can we do it without money? So for me, it's not very helpful. Of course, there's always a choice. Yeah. Yeah.
This or this or this.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah. But I just wanted to say it because, false in my head sometimes this false romance doesn't help either. So.
I'm becoming the mic person now, so is there somebody else?
I thought you wanted to pose a question. Thank you, Whitney. Hi.
Hi. But I thought, were you raising it? No? Going back to the end of time and death and what you said about the urgency that we all share in that. Can you hear me? I can't hear myself. Okay, and also ICE and sanctuary cities and shared urgency, and then finding out that the group didn't have a shared urgency. I wonder if we...
not a shared urgency,
or
not a shared value
system, a set of values. But I'm going back to BAK and the work that we're doing here, and I wonder how big is the shared urgency. I sometimes think, I wonder if there is a shared urgency, and compared to that moment at the end of death and our shared urgency, and how big is the gap right now in maybe there is no shared urgency, or is there? I was wrestle with that question, thinking there's a shared urgency, but is there?
Yeah, sorry. I don't think there is one shared urgency that we all share in that respect. I mean, it might be seen, and some people would be saying, okay, we all in some way implicated in the urgency of climate change or climate crisis, climate catastrophe from different perspectives. So you could see that notion of urgency that way, although I would never claim that we are in any urgency at any point together to the same extent. Yeah, and a lot of people not. Yeah, and so where I'm saying that I don't believe there's one urgency in which we are together to the same extent. I think every assembly is called to life because of that, of the urgency. It's a temporary assembly that dissolves at some point. So it's not like now we come together in revolution and going to change it. So I think I see it, when I think in images, I see it as a moving kind of field of changing valencies within certain urgencies and changing assemblies around it. And you know, the assembly. No, maybe this answer it. Maybe we can leave it here. There's if I can make a reference to few things that we did a whole conference on assemblism. It's all online on the BAK archive, which is quite interesting because this has become a kind of complicated subject. And of course, everybody talks about assemblies since Judy Butler's. Publication, you know, to the performative kind of, toward the performative assembly. But also this notion of death is something that I see more and more coming onto my radar. And in this new publication, Propositions for Non-Fascist Living, Tentative and Urgent, there happen to be two essays, one by Rosie Braidotti about affirmative ways of dying, and the other by Mick Wilson talking about the new moral economy of death to come. And so it is indeed something that is extraordinarily kind of pressing in the air, and it might be that one urgency in which we are together to some extent.
Yeah, and I think because you know that slide is up, that means end of time. But maybe end of discussable time, and then maybe time for coffee. Is there one more question, urgent question? Because otherwise I want to read you something to allude a little bit on that. Yeah?
We have time for one more?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you just said that politicians don't understand us. But who understands us? If you can explain who understands us? The second question is, if you say that money comes with ideology, that's the reality, that's the truth, then what are the possibilities? For example, if we all believe in certain truth, we believe that there is something which is good, why don't we all come together and share what we have? Rather than like when you're talking about that without money it is not possible, but we all who are sitting here have certain capital, whether it's social or cultural or whatever capital, in the terms of education, knowledge, spaces, friends, and all things. Are we really ready to share that together? And us versus them is not the solution, but what are the possible framework, what we already have, and how can we work with that? Are we ready to do that? That's one thing I think is important. Yeah, and which urgency is important when you say that there's not single urgency and a lot of urgencies, but what are urgencies which is going to be in power, which we believe that now. For example, when it started, I thought that we're going to have a deeper discussion, but in the last it comes to money, only fund cut. That's a reality, you know. But the problem is not only fund cut, it's beyond that, and how we as people who believe that we have a shared vision or we believe in something should be. How can we do what we have already with us? We are powerful, we should believe that. We have so much.
Thank you. Where to begin with this? Of course, the questions about finances were asked, and trust me, it's a deep discussion. Yeah, it's not about who pays which bills, but how, etc. I do believe there are within these practices, also within trainings for the not yet, there's a lot of exchanges that are not money exchanges. Huh? And when I talk about the sharing of resources or different, from the institutional perspective, different apportioning of resources, it's not just money. It's as simple thing as sharing time together, as sharing space, sharing meal, and the resources and knowledges and networks and etc., etc. So I don't identify fully with your analysis there that it's all about money. Money is hugely important, and not to forget, I mean, if you want to share space, somebody still needs to pay the rent of that space. So let's not be naive about it. Specifically within the circumstances where we find ourselves, and the circumstances of logistical capitalism where, etc., etc. Of course, I believe we need to thrive towards another world, towards another constellation. But before we get there, I think it's necessary to find spaces that could provide for that other kind of sharing in a way. You ask also something about hierarchy, or did I misunderstand?
No, I didn't ask this. It's just that if politicians don't understand, who understand us? That was the first question. There's a statement that politicians don't understand us.
You know, if you think who understands us, then that kind of division between us and them is just kept active. I just would want to seek circumstances where we, however complicated that notion is, can exchange. I don't know whether anybody understands us and should understand us. There might be a very intense yearning for getting together and understand one another. That's another question than who will understand us, I think. But these are such complicated issues in that are worthwhile kind of in-depth discussion. Do you want to add something, Jeanne, to this, or anybody?
No, I think it's exactly like, I mean, what you're alluding to is like that we have to find other ways of redistributing not only power, but also forms of like capital, if it's cultural, educational capital, and how do we share that together and create spaces that do not monetize those knowledges, but make them like shareable or make them like accessible. And I think this is a super important thing. It's a super important thing, and that's, I think, also for trainings for the not yet. It is very important that this is a collective sharing of these things together, in which we all like are the givers and the takers in that, and where we also have to practice that there are different forms of agencies that should provide the lead in that. So I think that is very important, and I just wanted, because I wanted just to do that, because the end of time thing came up, it's just give a little bit of the quote as a closing remark of what Marina Garcés talked about, and I'm just throwing the water.
Hydration.
When she talks about that, she says, and I have to quote, I have to put my glasses down. She says, the issue of what is in common to us is a question about commitment, about the contours of our different kinds of commitment to others and to the realities we share. It's evident that we have no easy answer to this question, and that beyond the most primal feelings we have for our nearest and dearest, family, friends, etc., we are unable to say what it is that really commits us to others and the realities, natural, social, or cultural, that we share. The fact is that commitment is not a problem of options, but of positions. Committing oneself is not a matter of joining a cause, party, or ideology, but it means taking up a position in a world we have in common and radically accepting the consequences. Committing oneself is discovering the world, discovering oneself in the world. It is deploying situated ethics and politics which arrive from each person asking about the presence of the world in me and me in the world. Committing oneself is not a problem of options. The time we could distract ourselves with fictions of a la carte lives is over. There are no options. There are no options. There are only the different way in which each person will have to give shape to his or her inescapable commitment.
Thank you, Jeanne. Thank you, Jeanne. Thank you, everybody. It's a break time. We're 20 minutes behind the schedule. So I wanted to propose to shorten the break. And so to 15 minutes, and we meet 5 over 3 here again. Thank you so much.